All folk songs have meaning. The song Bedlam Boys is no exception and has one of the richest and most complex meanings of any English folk song. To understand the song, it is necessary to go on a journey through the Second English Folk Revival, through Tudor English politics, voyeurism and freak shows, the history of madness, the history of social welfare, modern movie and literary sensationalism, and both literary and poetic criticism. So belt up tight and let the journey begin. Bedlam Boys falls into a very unique and interesting category of songs known as English mad songs. These songs were very popular during the 16th century and the 17th century. In these songs, the singer pretends to be a madman, usually a mad beggar, and the songs often have mention of Bedlam Mental Hospital, Europe's oldest mental hospital dating back to medieval times. The song was first published in the year of 1720 in a collection of folk songs called Wit and Mirth, or Pills to Purge Melancholy. The book was published by Thomas de Urfrey, containing over 1,000 songs, including Bedlam Boys. The song wasn't always called Bedlam Boys though. Its original name in de Urfrey's publication is Mad Magdalene. It's also called Mad Magdalene and Her Search for Her Tom of Bedlam. Another old name is Bonny Boys of Bedlam. In the 60s and the 70s it was known as Boys of Bedlam, but since then Bedlam Boys has been the popular name. The song first became of note at the end of the Second English Folk Revival. In the late 1960s, a very little known English folk band called the Halliard discovered the song and played it live. In de Urfrey's publication, the song contained both lyrics and music. Often with folk songs, you only get the lyrics but not the music, but in the case of Bedlam Boys, 17th century music is there too. The band the Halliard took the 17th century music and extensively modified it into what we know as the tune for Bedlam Boys today. I'll now play both songs side by side so you can compare with the original first. So, as you can hear, there's quite a lot of modification gone on from the original. However, in the modern version, you can still hear a lot of the original. The original is nowhere near as catchy as the revised version written by the Halliard, though. The Halliard's performances of these songs caught the eye of folk rock band Steel I Span, who recorded it on their 1971 album Pleased to See the King, under the name Boys of Bedlam. This popularized the song across Europe and North America. Lyrically, the song is about madness, as indeed all English mad songs are. It follows Mad Magdalene, who travels to a place called Bedlam Mental Hospital to visit her love, Tom of Bedlam, who's a resident there. The song is a response to a much older song called Tom of Bedlam, perhaps the most famous English mad song of them all. The song Tom of Bedlam predates Bedlam Boys by over 100 years and is often confused with it. In the original song, Tom of Bedlam, it's the story of a beggar who's driven mad by a woman known as Magdalene and goes around begging and stealing. It became the most famous English mad song of them all. The American author Harold Bloom called it the greatest anonymous poem in the English language. Bedlam Boys then is another songwriter sometime later reading the lyrics of Tom of Bedlam, writing the story of Magdalene or Mad Magdalene, inspired by the original Tom of Bedlam. In the late 18th century, the renowned writer and poetry aficionado Thomas Percy, Bishop of Tyrone, remarked on the peculiarity of just how many more songs about madness the English have than any other country. By that time, English mad songs had gone on a 200-year-long journey from being sung by itinerant beggars in the 16th century to becoming popular folk songs and musical ballads in the 17th and being the subject of classical music and operas in the 18th century. A quite amazing journey from the begging bowl to the royal box. And this 200-year-long journey begins in the 16th century and is tied in with Tudor politics, economics, and the changes in religious attitude of that era. Throughout the Tudor era, on a scale unmatched by any other era in English history, unemployment and vagrancy reached epidemic proportions and just wouldn't go away, despite attempts by each monarch to curb it. The problem began as England was going through the change from a feudal nation to a trading one. England's main industry was the wool trade, and landowners were converting their lands from farmland to sheep grazing land. To do this, the landowners had to evict the tenant farming families who had farmed the land since medieval times. And it was this forcing of people from the land that began the crisis. Traditionally, when crisis began and families fell on hard times, they would turn to the church. The Catholic Church owned around 25% of the cultivated land in England, and traditionally destitute families would be able to move onto this land and farm it. Also, the revenue from this land gave the church money to provide for the poor. However, Henry VIII's dissolution of the monasteries seized all this land from the church and nationalised it. It also took away all of the church's wealth. In doing this, effectively the entire medieval welfare system of England was ended at a stroke, and at a time England most needed it, with the problem of all the families that had been driven from their land by the landowners to convert it to sheep grazing land. However, these families didn't just lose their land, they lost something else, and that was sympathy. Along with England's conversion to Protestantism came a new attitude towards the poor, an attitude that people will be familiar with even today, that of the Protestant work ethic. These newly created poor were branded as the villains and responsible for their own poverty, as opposed to the landowners that evicted them from their land, and under the new Protestant ideology, it was their responsibility to find new work. Also, along with this new attitude, a new legal definition of poverty was created. That was the idea of worthy poor and unworthy poor. Worthy poor consisted of the aged, children, the mentally ill, and the physically disabled, as in people that were unable to work. The worthy poor were granted begging licenses and were able to legally beg for money. The other category was the unworthy poor. The unworthy poor consisted of able-bodied men and women of working age. For these people there was no sympathy, and they were not allowed to beg. They were legally required to find new work. However, there was a kick in the tail for them, in that they were not allowed to move to a new area to find work. They must find work in their own parish. And as their own parish would have been flooded with lots and lots of families all evicted from their land by their landlords, there would be a major crisis of unemployment, so little chance of finding new work. If they did move to a new area where there might have been work, such as to a town or a different part of the country, they were branded as vagabonds, and vagabond was a criminal class. Under Henry VIII, the government's reaction to the crisis of the people being driven from their land and the total dismantling by Henry VIII himself of the English welfare system was to pass strict laws punishing those people that had been made poor. For the unworthy poor, two crimes were created. One was beggars. Beggars were unworthy poor who begged in their own parish. For them, the punishment was being placed in the stocks. For those who were vagabonds, i.e. those who had travelled to a new town in search of work, there were 3 punishments. For their first offence, they were either stoned or whipped out of town. For the second offence, they would lose an ear, and for the third offence, they would be hung. In 1547, when Henry VIII died, England was ruled by a succession of 2 men. First the Duke of Somerset, known as the Good Duke, and then the Duke of Northumberland, known as the Bad Duke. The first act of the Good Duke was to successfully invade Scotland and occupy the country with a garrison. However, this garrison proved hugely expensive, and to pay for it, Somerset reduced the amount of silver in English coinage, completely debasing the currency and causing hyperinflation, a hyperinflation which would last unabated for decade after decade, plunging the economy into deep recession. This deep recession caused even more unemployment, even more homelessness and vagrancy, and just deepened the beggar and vagabond crisis that was engulfing all of England. To address the problem, the Good Duke's strategy was very predictable. He simply made the laws against these people even stricter. The new law was on first offence, they would be branded with a hot iron. On second offence, they were sold into slavery for 2 years, and for third offence, they were sold into slavery for life. The hated law, though, only survived for a few years, because the Bad Duke deposed the Good Duke and had him executed. The Bad Duke then abolished this law of slavery for the poor. In 1553, Mary Tudor, Bloody Mary, came to the throne. After executing the Bad Duke, she considered returning the land to the monasteries her father had taken, but eventually decided against it. When Bloody Mary married Philip V of Spain, this instantly put England in conflict with Spain's enemy, France. France's response was to cease all trade with England. England's main industry was the wool trade, and its biggest customer was France. Effectively, England had just lost its largest industry, and the deep economic crisis it was in just got even worse. In fact, from this period onwards, it became known as the Great Tudor Depression, and it is the worst depression in the whole of English history, and still only at its midpoint. When Bloody Mary was succeeded by her sister, Elizabeth, Good Queen Bess, she introduced a new worry about the poor: security concerns. Every Tudor ruler, except the Bad Duke, had faced major rebellions during their rule. And with at least 10% of the population of England now destitute and vagrants, she was very worried about rebellion and decided to act. Rather than attempting to alleviate the poverty, Good Queen Bess followed the example of her predecessors and introduced new harsher punishments to remove them from the streets. For the first offence, they were to have a hole bored in their ear by a hot poker. For the second offence, they were imprisoned, and for the third offence, they were hung. Good Queen Bess restored her father's death penalty for the poor. However, these new laws had little effect, and in fact the poverty became worse, as Good Queen Bess began to enclose much of the common land of England, driving those families from their land into poverty. She did this so she could sell the land to raise money for her invasion of Holland. it wasn't until 1603 and the coming of James VI of Scotland to England to take the English throne that the death penalty for poverty in England was finally abolished. Also, during his rule, the number of vagrants in England finally began to lessen, the Scottish king having the brainwave of sending them to Ireland. But that's another story. The emergence of mad songs, then, is directly linked to the completely incompetent rule of England by all of the Tudor monarchs, and an entire culture of vagrancy, begging, vagabondism, banditry emerged in England amongst the destitute poor. A destitute poor that almost every day of their lives, for no other reason than being poor and having for no fault of their own been driven off their land by wealthy landowners, faced at worst the death penalty and at best slavery or mutilation simply for their plight. And with this Great Recession lasting 3/4 of a century, whole generations were born, lived their entire life and died in vagrancy. With so many people destitute, there would be a huge variety of different people living on the streets, and a whole varied culture would emerge. Some people would use violent crime, some people would use non-violent crime. Other people would use much more subtle methods by trying to beat the draconian laws. One of these methods was quite simple. Members of the unworthy poor would try and pretend to be members of the worthy poor. Pretending to be old or a child would be very difficult, but pretending to be mad or disabled would be much more achievable. However, these are by no means the only strategies. In fact, so diverse were the strategies and so many different kinds of vagabonds and beggars there were on the street that in 1561 a John Alderley published a pamphlet that gave a guide to the different kinds of people living on the street. He called the book The Fraternity of Vagabonds, subtitled "As well of ruffling vagabonds and of beggarly women and of men, of girls and boys, girls spelt Gyres and boys spelt Boyes." And he prefaces the pamphlet by calling it a description of the crafty company of cozeners and shifters, the 25 order of knaves, or the quantern of knaves. Obviously, it's not a book with any great sympathy for the poor. It's more the tabloid journalism of its day, obviously to scare moneyed people. In the book, he just gives a description of 25 kinds of beggars and vagabonds on the street, along with a lurid description of what they do. The language is obscure, so often it's a little bit difficult to work out what exactly the vagabonds were, but in many of the cases we can. So thanks to Project Gutenberg, I'll now go through the types of vagabonds in England at that time, according to the Daily Mail of the day, so best not taken too seriously. The first class are Abraham men, which he describes as Abraham man is he that walketh bare-armed and bare-legged, and feigneth himself mad, and carry a pack of wool, or a stick with bacon on it, or such like toy, and name himself Poor Tom. So here in the very first description, we have what we're exactly looking for in this entire video: unworthy poor, pretending to be mad so they're mistaken as the worthy poor and not punished by the authorities. And also says that he named himself Poor Tom. Poor Tom obviously comes from the word Tom of Bedlam, and it was common at that time for mad people to be called Toms. The song Tom of Bedlam was already so popular by the 1560s. In fact, in Chappell's book Songs of Olden England, there's at least 3 versions of Tom of Bedlam, the song in it. So there were multiple versions of the song, and insane people were called Toms. The second kind of vagabond is a more sinister one. They're called rufflers. Basically, these people pretend to be disabled old soldiers, again pretending to be one of the classes of worthy poor. But these ones are only doing it as a strategy to rob people at sword point. Prigmen are very interesting because apparently they walked around with sticks, again pretending to be disabled, but their stick was just a ruse as they used it for lifting and stealing washing, which in those days was hung out to dry on hedgerows, not washing lines. As I said, the worthy poor could get begging licenses, but obviously there was an industry for counterfeit begging licenses, and another class of beggar was a whipjack, a person who'd obtained a fraudulent begging license. A freighter is a person who begs for some sort of charity or holy order. The word might be something along the lines of friar, but just bastardized by the late 16th century. An upright man appears to be some sort of gangster who makes himself leader of the local vagabonds and beggars and then extorts money from them through violence. A curtal is very much like an upright man, but seems to run prostitutes, so is some sort of pimp. A palliard seems to be among the lowest rungs of beggar and half-starved and malnourished. An Irish toil is a person who does have some wealth, but pretends to be poor, goes out begging to get money, and then returns home to his wife and servants. A jugman is a forger who makes counterfeit begging licenses and sells them. A washman is another man who pretends to be disabled to beg, generally pretending he's lame in the arms or legs. A wild rogue seems to be someone who goes around making mischief amongst a gang of friends and family. Next is a kitchen mort, which is a girl, and she's apparently brought to an upright man. Upright man was the gangster we were talking about, and she apparently works for him as a doxy until she come to the honour of an autumn, and I have no idea what an autumn is. Next is the definition of a doxy, and it says it's those who go working laces and shirt strings. Bringing my reading of Moll Flanders in, perhaps it's a lace thief. Next is the patriarch. Now patriarchs very might well be former deposed Catholic priests, and they apparently make a living by making marriages. Courtesy men is another kind of beggar, but this one dresses well, goes to a wealthy area and picks on young affluent men and tries to talk them out of large sums of money. Cheaters or fingerers is another type of beggar or vagabond that operated by going to wealthy areas and pretending to be young wealthy men, befriending some young wealthy men and taking them to a pub and basically con the young wealthy man out of a lot of money in gambling games. Ring foolers were a similar type of vagabond. They made their money by gold plating copper rings and selling them to the wealthy. So as we can see, an entire culture or subculture of methods of survival for the poor had emerged. For the purposes of this video, the one we're interested in is the very first one, the Abraham man or Abraham men. Abraham men pretended to be insane and often pretended to be residents of the medieval mental asylum Bedlam. A description of 1675 from the London Gazette describes them. Several vagrant persons do wander about pretending themselves to be lunatics under the cure of the hospital of Bedlam, commonly called Bedlam, with brass plates about their arms and inscriptions thereon. Among the Abraham men there would have been many different strategies, for some walking about as described and pretending to be ex-residents of Bedlam would be one. Others apparently walked down the street pretending to be quite crazy and ranting and talking to themselves. For another group who had the ability to sing, singing songs was their method to get money. The songs apparently would take on most commonly one of two themes. It would either be the person pretending to be insane would sing a song about being crazy. The lyrics of the song Bedlam Boys are a great example of this, as the singer is singing about how they go to Hell's Kitchen, how they slay giants with their staves, how they meet fairies. An alternative strategy is that the singer would sing about the goings-on inside the hospital of Bedlam. Because they are pretending to be an ex-resident of Bedlam, they would have an insight as to what it's really like inside, and they would be letting people know what it's like inside in their song, i.e. revealing information. So this is how English mad songs emerged, in a rather long and drawn-out historical explanation. For the next part of this video, we move on to Bedlam itself. The word Bedlam refers to Bedlam Royal Hospital, a psychiatric hospital in London that was founded in 1247 and is still going today. In modern Britain, the word Bedlam today is synonymous with madness, where public events that descend into chaos can be described as Bedlam. Bedlam also, of all England and later Britain's psychiatric hospitals, caught the public imagination and became popularised in fiction and later horror movies as a place of terror, mad doctors, human experiments, monsters, ghosts. In its 800-year history, Bedlam achieved fame and notoriety in equal measure, attracting poets, writers, artists, inspiring horror movies and becoming part of popular culture. And the word Bedlam itself entered the English language as part of a number of sayings to indicate insanity. Bedlam the hospital itself was founded in 1247 as a hospital for sick paupers, located at the site of what is now Liverpool Street Station. Initially, the hospital was for the treatment of the sick poor, but within 100 years, it seems to have begun to specialise in mentally ill patients. It is described in the 15th century as being a small building, covering just 2 acres, centred around a courtyard with a chapel. It had approximately 12 cells for patients, a kitchen, staff accommodation and an exercise yard. More sinisterly, there were 11 chains, 6 locks, 2 pairs of stocks. However, all the patients were not locked up. The non-dangerous ones were given the freedom to walk around the courtyard and, some believe, actually outside the hospital, while the dangerous ones were kept chained up in solitary confinement. The number of patients during the Tudor period at the hospital seems to have been extremely low. In the year 1600, there were supposedly only 20 residents, 15 men and 5 women. Most of these residents had been there for a long time, ranging from anything from 8 to 25 years, though there were a small number of short-term residents. By about the 1560s, the numbers had gone up to about 60 patients, and by the year 1700, there were apparently over 90 patients in the hospital. However, with hundreds of thousands of beggars and vagabonds on the streets of Tudor England, and potentially thousands of them pretending to be ex-Bedlamites and insane, the numbers clearly don't match, as no more than a few dozen of them at any one time could potentially have been genuinely ex-Bedlamites. From medieval times to the end of Tudor times, Bedlam seems to have been of no great notoriety. It was merely a small mental hospital for paupers. There would have been other ones for wealthy people, which would have had much better conditions, so the hospital wasn't of great notoriety. That was until the Tudor times and the English mad songs came out. The mad songs of the poor of the Tudor era, as we know, moved in the 17th century from the streets into theatres, musicals, and became popular entertainment. And as this happened, Bedlam itself became the subject of much interest and literature. Between 1700 and 1730, Bedlam was to feature in almost a dozen major plays. In fact, such interest had been sparked in the hospital that from 1598 until 1770, the hospital was opened up for public visiting. It was the only mental hospital opened up for public visiting, and basically became a freak show for wealthy visitors. And it became a tourist attraction for both British visitors and foreign. In 1610, Lord Percy recorded going to see the lions at the Tower, the show of Bedlam, and the fireworks at the Artillery Gardens. A more in-depth description of what visiting Bedlam was like was provided by César de Saussure, and his account of his visit as one of the London sights. He describes, "You find yourself in a long wide gallery on either side, of which are a large number of little cells where lunatics of every description are shut up, and you can get a sight of these poor creatures, little windows being let into the doors. Many inoffensive madmen walk the big gallery. On the second floor is a corridor and cells like those on the first floor, and this is the part reserved for dangerous maniacs, most of them being chained and terrible to behold. On holidays, numerous persons of both sexes, but belonging generally to the lower classes, visit the hospital and amuse themselves watching these unfortunate wretches, who give them cause for laughter. On leaving this melancholy abode, you are expected by the porter to give him a penny, but if you happen to have no change and give him a silver coin, he will keep the whole sum and return you nothing." While the freak show that was going on was pretty revolting, when the government finally did stop it in 1770, things actually got worse for the patients, as this was a major source of income for the hospital, which now was forced to rely only on donations. And conditions for the patients got worse. Also, the number of people in the hospital got larger and larger, and by the time of the Napoleonic Wars, there were 200 patients in Bedlam, most of them soldiers suffering from shell shock or post-traumatic stress disorder. It was then the new hospital was created at its current location today, just outside London. Bedlam then had caught the public imagination, from the mad songs of the 1600s, to the plays of the 17th century, to the operas of the 18th century, and even Hogarth's A Rake's Progress. In the 19th century, it was to feature in horror literature, as a place where people could be locked up. Ironically, all the people being locked up in the 19th century literature were generally from middle class or upper class families, and they couldn't potentially be locked up at Bedlam because Bedlam was a hospital simply for paupers and no one else. In the 20th century, Bedlam was joined in literature by being featured in movies and TV, the original of these being Boris Karloff's 1940s film Bedlam. However, these were quickly followed by a large number of Hammer horror movies, which featured mental hospitals and Bedlam in abundance. Other references to Bedlam can be found in Batman with Arkham Asylum, and possibly even the spate of movies such as Friday the 13th or Halloween, where people have escaped from mental asylums, could be attributed to the popularity of Bedlam in English literature. Bedlam continues today as a modern psychiatric hospital, but its name is a word for madness, for terrible conditions, for suffering, and for horror. All folk songs have stories behind them, and these folk songs give us access to an area that history very rarely covers, that of the poorest people, the people whose histories generally aren't covered in history books. Unfortunately, a lot of the history of these songs is lost or very scant. With Bedlam Boys, however, we can trace a very, very rich folk history. But just not a very rich folk history, a quite astonishing one. A history where the poorest of the poor, the vagrants and beggars of Tudor times, driven off their farmland by greedy landowners and living in generations of absolute poverty, created a culture that is still with us today. A culture of mad songs that have been described as some of the finest poetic works in the English language, that have inspired great plays, operas, artists, that created an entire genre of fascination with madness in English history, and a genre that continues today in the horror movie industry. Dozens, if not hundreds, of versions of Bedlam Boys can be found all over YouTube. People will be playing the song, if not tonight, this week or this month, across Europe, from Eastern Europe to Western Europe and North America, where the song has become popular. And some of these people may even appreciate just what a piece of folk culture they're playing. Because ultimately, folk music is about the history of the common folk, and Bedlam Boys is about as good an example as you can find. Now, I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you do, subscribe and like. I'll probably do another melodic history sometime, perhaps before the decade is finished. And I'll also do some other very obscure history videos. But until then, I think I'll now completely embarrass myself and grab hold of my medieval bagpipes and play us out. And everyone can see what a truly awful musician I really am.